The Holy Bible was indeed right in the portion that says, "The heart of man is desperately wicked." This can be said to be true when it comes to the oppressive nature experienced in the white governance for as long as anyone can remember. If not, how does one explain the height of inhumanity and dreary tortures poured out on blacks for centuries past and in present day? And for what exactly? White supremacy. Blacks, though, have showcased strong resilience over the years, have been through, and are still going through a whole lot in the white world. From slavery, where they were treated less than brutes, while being overexploited, to the stealing of lands given to freed black slaves as a form of reparation for their years of enslavement, now further enslaving and subjugating the freed slaves and even their generations after. And do you know the shocking part in all of these? It is the fact that the law is being used as a tool to steal or dispossess these freed slaves of their lands, thereby making it a legal theft. Hence, no one sees the wrong done, and no one talks about it. How intelligent. Nonetheless, in this very video, we are going to be examining how the U.S. used property law to steal lands from freed black slaves. But before we continue, do not forget to support our efforts by hitting that like button before you. Share with your family and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and kindly subscribe to stay tuned in if you are yet to. We are very glad to have you here with us. Now let's back into business. Black land theft is not a topic heavily discussed, but like redlining, it allows people to see that African Americans falling behind financially is not because they don't try, but because every time they had a chance to get ahead, laws, rules, regulations, and those with power use the system to bend the rules to take from them what is rightfully theirs. When it comes to black land theft, it wasn't just government institutions, it was white people who had the money and knew the laws they could use to swindle African American landowners. The rules and laws in place allowed white people to use government rules and institutions to not only steal land but enrich themselves once they got a hold of it. And because this massive theft was accomplished through thousands of small transactions over decades, it was easy for the rest of us to look the other way. Now, let us take a look at how freed black slaves acquired their lands before being dispossessed of them. In 1862, the United States government passed the Homestead Act. This act gave certain Americans seeking farmland the right to apply for ownership of government land or the public domain. This newly acquired farmland was typically called a homestead. In all, more than 160 million acres of public land, or nearly 10% of the total area of the United States, was given away for free to 1.6 million homesteaders. However, until the United States abolished slavery in 1865 and the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, enslaved and free blacks could not benefit from these acts. At the time of emancipation, Union General William T. Sherman's plan to give newly freed families 40 acres and a mule was among the first and most significant promises made to African Americans, but was unfortunately broken. As the Union Army gradually took over Confederate territory, there was a question as to what freedom really meant for emancipated slaves. Without property, money, or an education, most did not have a clear or immediate path toward economic independence. Take note, Sherman was not an abolitionist, and the idea to redistribute land was not his own. Indeed, it was presented to Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton by a group of black ministers in Savannah, Georgia, who told them that the way they can best take care of themselves is to have land and turn it and till it by their own labor. On January 16, 1865, Sherman issued his Special Field Order 15, which commanded that 400,000 acres of property confiscated from Confederate landowners be redistributed to black families in 40-acre plots. By June, the land had been allocated to 40,000 of a total of 4 million freed slaves. Mules were not included in the order, but the Union Army did give some away as part of the effort. Unfortunately, the order was short-lived. President Andrew Johnson, who had owned slaves and publicly shared his beliefs of white supremacy, overturned the order before the end of the year and returned the land to the slave owners and traders who had originally owned it. The long-term financial implications of this reversal is staggering. By some estimates, the value of 40 acres and mules for those 40,000 freed slaves would be worth $640 billion today. Again, landless and in need of income, many former slaves were forced into sharecropping, a form of indentured servitude in which a landowner rents out plots of land to laborers in exchange for a portion of the crops produced. In addition to providing land, landowners often also extended credit to the sharecroppers to purchase materials like seeds and fertilizer from them. Typically, this arrangement was only marginally better than slavery, as landowners were known to charge unfairly high interest rates and intentionally underpay sharecroppers. keeping them in an endless cycle of debt and poverty. But despite substantial hurdles, Black Americans still managed to acquire 15 million acres of land by 1910, much of which was used for agricultural purposes. At the peak in 1920, Black families owned and operated upwards of 1 million farms, about 14% of all farms at the time. The ability to grow crops and raise livestock afforded Black families not just food and financial security, but also the opportunity for upward mobility. They did so in spite of the constant threat of forced dispossession at the hands of white mobs and officials. Sometimes Black property owners did face sudden and violent attacks then, such as the racial cleansing of Forsyth County, Georgia, in 1912, and the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921. As often, though, whites undermined Black property ownership by more subtle means. White tax assessors routinely overvalued Black-owned land, forcing Black property owners to bear a heavier tax burden than whites. They make them pay for services they didn't receive, thereby slowly draining families of earnings. If Black-owned property became valuable, or a Black property owner challenged white supremacy, local officials could simply declare the property tax delinquent and sell it at a tax sale. Writing in 1940, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Special Counsel, Thurgood Marshall, described the manipulation of tax delinquency laws by white officials in the South as a practice and custom of depriving Negroes of their property through subterfuge. Despite all these, at the dawn of the Civil Rights era, African Americans still held substantial amounts of land, mostly in the South, a major portion of which was in some of the region's fastest growing areas and hottest real estate markets. Thanks to huge federal investments during the New Deal, the South in the mid-20th century went from being what President Franklin Roosevelt described as the nation's #1 economic problem in the 1930s to the booming Sun Belt by the 1960s. The region's rapid growth, along with the emergence of new industries like vacationing and tourism in rural and coastal areas, created an insatiable demand for land and made Black property owners targets for removal by white officials and plunder by profit-seeking speculators. Over the past century, Black farmers lost most of their land, leaving just 45,500 operators with a mere 0.52% of American farmland in 2017. Industrialization, which lured Americans of all races away from rural areas and into cities for better opportunities, is partly to blame. But there were other factors at play which we will examine right away. Across a century, white farmers and landowners developed multiple ways to take the lands of African Americans, using methods such as heirs property, tax sales, and Torrens Acts. To understand the magnitude of this land theft, one must examine the extreme measures taken by those who captured the land from African American landowners. Both laws and practices allowed white landowners, farmers, and developers to manipulate the system so they could gain control over the land owned by African American farmers and homeowners. The ways people were allowed to take land differed by state, with each having its own approach to scheme Black people out of their land. However, heirs property was a method used across all of them. In most cases, Black people did not have wills that would transfer land from one person to another after the death of the rightful owner. So, with no will involved, the land was divided equally amongst all of the known descendants. And as those descendants began to pass away, the land would keep being divided by their descendants. Over generations, the number of owners would become substantial, and this created challenges for the landowners. According to Modern Farmer, since using heirs property as collateral on a mortgage to subdivide it, to develop it, and any number of other things of a legally binding nature, is difficult without first identifying and tracking down every heir and gaining consent from each one. Thus, it eventually became easy enough for other people to come in and take control of the land, especially when every family member could not be found to seek permission for selling the land. So even if some members of the family wanted to keep the land, other members could choose to sell it. White developers would end up preying on family miscommunication and taking control of the land. The next method used to scheme Black people out of their land was tax sales. Tax sales were a way that the land could be taken from its owners and auctioned off. In these cases, Black people would want to stay on their land instead of selling it, but most of them lived on a fixed income. Consequently, many of these homeowners eventually found themselves unable to afford their annual property taxes. Once they were in default, the county would put the property up for auction. This was something that developers used as an advantage when they wanted to access land families didn't want to sell. The story of Evelina Jenkins, a Black South Carolina Sea Islands native, offers a case in point. Evelina Jenkins owned dozens of acres of property, including an entire island, at a time in the early 1970s when land values along the state's coastline were skyrocketing. As a result of the state's pitiful expenditures on colored schools, Ms. Jenkins had received only minimal education and never learned to read. Decades of disfranchisement and white control of local government and the courts had taught her that whatever rights and protections it afforded did not apply to her. Even venturing inside the local government offices where people registered for licenses or paid their taxes was an invitation to be mistreated and humiliated, and was something to avoid. So, Ms. Jenkins entrusted a white neighbor who had befriended her to take her annual property tax payments to town for her. But rather than submitting Ms. Jenkins's payments, he pocketed them, then waited for her taxes to fall delinquent, whereupon he bought the lien to her property at the county's annual tax auction. Then, after the statutory redemption window closed, he gained title to her land holdings, island and all, which he subsequently resold to a developer. In the decades since, the land Jenkins once owned has generated untold amounts of wealth. Houses on the island she once owned today sell for upward of $400,000. Ms. Jenkins, though, never saw a dime of it. Rather than leave her children an ample inheritance, she died penniless, forced to live out her last days in her daughter's mobile home. So pathetic. While Ms. Jenkins' case was particularly outrageously bad, the legal theft of black land in similar ways was not uncommon. In booming real estate markets like Hilton Head and surrounding sea islands, tax sales afforded investors a lucrative opportunity to acquire valuable property for pennies on the dollar. Here and elsewhere, local tax assessors served as accessories before the fact, deliberately overvaluing black-owned land or enacting sharp, capricious assessment spikes as development crept near, all aimed at forcing poor black farming families to sell under duress or steering them into tax delinquency. Tax sales were just one of several ways speculators and developers manipulated property and tax laws and exploited historic inequities to expropriate black people's land. A third method was called the Torrens Acts. The Torrens Acts was based off of the Torrens systems, which was first used in 1858 in Australia. It was developed by Sir Robert Torrens for the purpose of enhancing the certainty of title to land and to simplify dealings involving land. When introduced in the United States, the Torrens Act was supposed to be used to simplify title registry. Instead, it became a loophole that allowed third parties to forcibly remove families from their property through partition sales. Partition sales take place when one of a property's owners wants to sell, but the others do not. The Torrens Act and related rules allowed sales to take place without the notification of family members or other co-owners of the land until they are served an eviction notice. And once the sale was made, the rules associated with the Torrens Act protected the buyer from any legal recourse by the owners who did not know about or agree to the sale. As a result of this, predatory land speculators would search for a person who had recently inherited land this way and was willing to sell his or her share. Once the sale went through, the speculator, now a co-owner of the property, would have the right to petition the courts to order a sale of the entire tract of land against the wishes of those family members who lived on it and would then buy it. These partition sales invariably resulted in the land being sold at well below its market value, enriching the buyer while leaving the displaced and dispossessed family members with nothing. Speculators have used this legal trick to force the sale of millions of acres of black-owned land over the past several decades. Only in the past few years have some states begun to adopt a uniform law designed to curb the most predatory abuses of heirs' property, although much of the damage has been done already. Going forward, many of the techniques used to take black-owned land remain legal today. The tax sale law that allowed someone to steal Ms. Jenkins's land remains on the books in South Carolina and many other states, and continues to be used to extract wealth from poor and vulnerable communities across America. The cumulative effect of these methods used over a century to steal land or otherwise manipulate families out of their land was devastating. In Mississippi alone, the land stolen from 1950 to 1964 totaled up to 800,000 acres. A research team calculated the value of the stolen land in Mississippi to be $3.7 billion to $6.6 billion in today's dollars. And these estimates of whites' wealth extraction from African Americans through land theft are just for one state. The uncomfortable truth remains that the prosperity of Americans has not bypassed black Americans so much as it has come directly at their expense. Indeed, slavery and Jim Crow not only excluded generations of black Americans from benefits and opportunities enjoyed by white Americans, it also exposed them to the most predatory features of the capitalist system. It turned the earnest attempts of black people to build wealth the American way, through property ownership, into an opportunity for others to profit at their expense. In conclusion, it is now so glaring how the US of A used property law as a weapon to systematically dispossess black freed slaves of their land and property rights, perpetuating a legacy of racial inequality and economic injustice that continues to impact black communities to this day. It is crucial that whites acknowledge and confront this dark chapter in their nation's history and work towards reparations and restitution for the descendants of those who were wronged. Only through acknowledging and addressing the injustices of the past can we hope to build a more equitable and just society for all. That would bring us to the end of yet another video segment. Did you happen to learn a thing or two? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. We are always delighted to pick from your thoughts. Support our works also by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and kindly subscribe to stay tuned in, whilst you also help in building the rising membership of this channel. We are glad to have you always. Thank you for watching.